Welcome to Work Life by Design. I'm your host, Mel Marsden. If the last few years have taught us anything, it's that change is inevitable and we no longer need to go to work to work. As a workplace dynamic strategist and the founder of Community, I draw back the curtains on my own business, the clients and projects that we deliver, along with tapping into the knowledge and insights from academics, business leaders and champions of change. I believe that our environments have the power to positively influence our behaviour and performance, inspiring our human potential. This program was made possible with the support from the Alistair Swain Foundation. To find out more, go to alistairswainfoundation.org. In April this year, the Managing the Risk of Psychosocial Hazards at Work Code of Practice 2022 came into effect. As someone who runs a business and employs people, naturally I was interested to learn more about what this means for me and for the projects that I get to work on. So to help me understand the code a little further, I invited my colleague and friend, Dr Meg Hooper, to join me to discuss it. Now, Meg is the CEO and Principal Consultant at Carousel Consulting, the experts in organisational change and building resilient teams. So with Meg's background in supporting many in organisation, she was the obvious choice to talk me through it. So in today's episode, we're going to discuss what is a psychosocial hazard in the workplace, how a psychosocial hazard is different from psychological safety, who is impacted by the code, and what do businesses need to do. Plus, we explore a few of the hazards that we encounter in the work that we both do and what organisations can do to mitigate their risk. This was a really interesting and highly relevant conversation that left me with a much broader understanding of the code and in many ways how the work that we are both already doing is setting organisations up for success. Now, we do discuss a number of resources during today's chat, all of which you will be able to find the links for in the show notes. So let's dive in. So I'm joined here again today by Dr Meg Hooper, and she is going to be sharing with us some insights into how we can start to manage some of the psychosocial hazards and risks in our workplace. So there was a new code of conduct that came out last year, but it's only come into effect from the 1st of April this year, from what I understand. But I've invited Meg along to come and have a chat with us around what's in it, what we should be looking out for, and what we can do to start to manage some of these risks within our workplace. So thanks for joining me, Meg.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I love talking about this stuff.
I know you do. And look, I'm going to preface all of this whole conversation with the fact that this isn't an area that I'm an expert in. It's an area that I know Meg has a lot more understanding in. And so hence the reason I've got her to come along and chat with us today. And so I'm going to play the person here who has absolutely no idea and ask all the dumb questions as we go through so that we can start to get an understanding of what this actually means for us in our workplaces. So Meg, first question I've got for you is, can you start to firstly outline for us what is a psychosocial risk? What are we looking at here? What does that mean?
Yeah, I think what is new about this code is that it is, so I'll just take a step back and talk to why this is important and then to talk to what the hazards and risks are. So the reason why this is important is that, and it's such a progressive move on behalf of WorkSafe in Queensland, is that it really elevates the role of mental health and mental well-being and psychological health of human beings that come to work and do jobs. And as I've said to you many times, neither you or I are experts in workplace health and safety. And that's really where the code sits. It sits as a practice underneath the Workplace Health and Safety Act. But the hazards that it refers to are the sorts of hazards that you and I intervene on every day. And the hazards are those hazards that impact on psychological health. And I think from my observations, the hazards are those things that cause stress, those things that mean that we find it difficult to regulate our emotional response to things. It could be that there's a combination of physical and mental health in that the workload that I take on is too high. And so all of these hazards are present in every workplace. They exist in nearly every workplace. It's just that we're mitigating the risk, you and I, and you as well, even though, sometimes you go, oh, I'm not sure I understand this code. But actually the work that you do mitigates the risks that those hazards will be problematic and contribute to poor mental health. And I think the other thing that's really important is that this is elevating the role of the workplace as a contributor to individuals' sense of well-being, psychological health, and mental health as well. And despite us not being experts in legislation, in the Act, and in how codes operate and how they should be used, I think, as you've already sort of started to talk about, the hazards themselves are an area that we can talk through.
And so what's the difference between a psychosocial hazard and the idea of psychological safety? So, psychological safety has been around as a concept and a conversation, back from 2012 when Google did their Project Aristotle, and, Professor Amy Edmonds has been talking about this. What's the difference? Like, what are we talking about here?
Psychological safety is a group level variable, and it refers to the freedom of shame or fear in having a voice. So that's a very general statement, but it basically means at a practical level, it means within my team, I don't hold back on sharing my opinions with others. I don't hold back on sharing concerns. I don't hold back on sharing ideas because I'm worried that they'll be rejected. I'll be socially rejected from the group or alienated from the group. And it's often a perceived rejection and a perceived alienation. It's almost like a subculture that emerges on how we treat people who share opinions, how we treat people who expose risks or hazards and those sorts of things. So there is a little bit of a relationship between those two, but not in concept. And, I'm a massive fan of Amy Edmondson's work, and we work with psychological safety a lot because most of our interventions are team-based interventions. Psychological health and well-being is a well-being measure. It's a feeling of wellness from a psychological point of view, and it's an individual level phenomenon. So while a psychologically safe environment might give you opportunities to voice concerns about the hazards to psychosocial health, it's not the same thing. It's not the same thing as psychosocial health because psychosocial health responds to a whole bunch of hazards in the workplace.
Yeah, so they're two different things, and hazards are one thing, and then safety is more of a behavioural piece that sort of sits within that and the way that a team interacts and creates culture, whereas a hazard is something that the organisation can start to do from, a change in a policy and an environmental piece. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but who is actually impacted by the application and the enforcement of this code? Is it all businesses? Are small businesses currently excluded? What does that look like? Do you know?
I think, and look, again, this is not the area of my expertise, but I think there are some businesses that already have an approach to this that are excluded. Say, for example, there are some businesses in mining, but those businesses will know who they are. They're of a size where they've got a response to mental health and wellbeing in the workplace anyway. The code itself, just like the Workplace Health and Safety Act, applies to anyone who is they call it PCBUs, person conducting business, that's it. And look, at the end of the day, this code is really just talking about what's good practice and how we run a workplace and people's experience of that work.
Yeah. Okay. So what are organisations and businesses needing to do? I mean, we've talked about the fact that there's a number of hazards here, and I've had a look through the acts as well and the documentation, and we're going to pop all the links to those in the show notes as well, so you can jump in and look at this. But it outlines a number of risks, and I suppose let's just pick out a couple, Meg, and let's just talk through them and understand what how do businesses go about identifying these risks, and then what can we actually start to do to manage them.
Yeah, for sure. I think what organisations need to do is to be intentional about how they approach this. And look, the resources available on this are outstanding. The Office of Industrial Relations and WorkSafe have done an amazing job at putting together resources, particularly for small business. And I'd encourage anyone, even if you don't run a small business, the packages put together for small business are excellent. I think when it comes to the hazards themselves, and look, there are many of them that are listed as types of hazards within the code itself, but there are some that you and I deal with on a daily basis. I think one of the first ones that is important for me when I think about change management interventions is low job control. And look, there are going to be roles in organizations that have less control over how they shape their day, how they schedule their work, the tools they use to do their job. However, we need to understand that that can be a hazard for psychosocial health, in that the experience of control at work is an important thing for human beings. And having a low level of control, particularly in some circumstances. So if you're in a client-facing role, for example, and there are processes and there are rules, and you have very little control over the way that you approach your work, and you're faced with a problem, say, for example, you have a client that is very aggressive, and this is one of the examples that they use in some of the packages, and you've got no control over how you approach that aggressive client, then not only are you faced with this really awful situation, you've got no way of feeling like you're in control of it. So it can create a sense of unsafety, I guess, or lack of safety, I should say, which is no one wants to experience that at work. And for me, because when we're implementing change, we deal with so many groups that have very low levels of job control, it's something at the forefront of my mind as to how do I make sure that I'm not putting pressure on jobs that don't have any control in the face of change.
And so if we think about some of the other examples, I mean, and as you said, there's a number of examples that are given within the documents that we'll put those links into that are very specific, and it gives you ideas on how to do that. There's even a risk calculator that you can go through as well and start preparing that for your business. But there's a few things in there that, you and I have talked about in terms of the way that our particular roles in what we do when working with clients can actually start to support and shape these things. And one of those is actually poor environmental conditions, and that's well and truly in my alley. That's something that's totally in my control. And when we look at that, it's talking about, poor quality or hazardous work environments. And some examples include hazardous manual tasks, which, we've all been kind of very conscious of in the past, making sure that, the physical performance of work is safe. But poor air quality. So poor air quality has been a hot topic, and particularly after COVID, talking about, the quality of the building air conditioning systems. And, for many of us in, corporate buildings in the city, that's probably less of a concern because they're maintained at a different level. But if we're talking about isolated, freestanding buildings in rural areas or anything else, then that's when we're probably starting to look at that poor air quality or lack of air quality altogether. High noise levels. So if we've got reverberating plant or things like that starts to cause noise distress, but also high noise levels. We've talked earlier about Dr. Libby Sanders' work and the physiological responses that people have to elevated noise in the workplace. So this could actually extend out to being, just poor acoustics. And if we go back and we, slam our poor old mate, the open plan workplace again, it's the fact that we don't have that effective sound attenuation within those environments, and that's then physiologically affecting people's ability to concentrate, their stress response levels, and their performance as a result. Extreme temperatures. We're probably looking at, what I would consider to be, again, quite extremes when we're talking about workplaces, because extreme temperatures, I would think, would have to be quite fluctuating. We're not talking about, the air conditioning's 3 degrees cooler over here and, Sally wants to wear her jumper and, Joe's hot, which happens in every work environment because we all run at a different body temperature. Regulating air conditioning is always a challenge. I think where there's, I suppose, almost room for interpretation here is, what does extreme look like? What is that threshold? Where is those boundaries around this tolerance that we're looking at? Do you have any thoughts on that? Like, what's your perspective on that?
Well, I think this is where we talk to experts in physiological responses to and subsequent cognitive responses to temperature. I mean, we know that very brief exposure to cold can increase focus, but that's because our brain's probably going, oh my God, it's cold. Let's get out of here. And I think, look, this is a particular area in workplace health and safety itself. And I think what the code is doing is bringing in that physiological response and the mental health response to that as well. If you're constantly working in Queensland, heat is probably more likely to be the hazard, and it's always been acknowledged as a hazard in the workplace for outdoor workers in particular, but acknowledging that those conditions, the impact of that can accumulate and can have a detrimental effect to someone's sense of well-being. and mental well-being as well. I think that's where the acknowledgement is why this code is so important, that we're not just treating a physical response, we're treating a sense of well-being, a psychological well-being response. And in those circumstances, from what I understand, that's an overtime, so repeated exposure to uncomfortable conditions. And part of it is that our cognitive load is so, and Libby talks about this as well, and maybe not necessarily about heat, but you can see the parallels. Our cognitive load is so high because our sympathetic nervous system is kicked in to help us be able to perform our job in these circumstances. It means that we've got no capacity to think about anything else. And that load it's effort. And so I think that it's draining and it's exhausting. And when we're exhausted, we also put ourselves at higher risk for other safety issues as well.
Enjoying the episode? I would love it if you would share this show with just one person who you think it would inspire. Just one. The more we can share the insights of what it takes to make work work, the closer we are to elevating everyone's experience of work. And, one of the other examples that they've given here is about poor workplace relationships and including interpersonal conflict. And this is where I start to look at, the role that the workplace has to play in creating relationships and supporting the effective development of relationships. When I go in and I start working with organisations, I want to understand what are those interdepartmental relationships? What does those organisational relationships look like? What does belonging and inclusivity need to look like in this organisation? And then going about creating an environment that actually physically enables and supports that. But that's a structural level, a physical application. What about from more of a process or a policy or a cultural perspective?
Yeah, I think you can think about it at lots of different levels of the organisation. At an individual level, positive relationships are a source of positive emotion, and positive emotion allows me to much better regulate my response to the hard stuff that goes on at work. So, when I'm faced with a stressful situation or I'm faced with pressure, it could be that the job that I'm doing has high demands. Positive relationships, we know, and particularly in teams can have a protective effect on stress responses or resilience responses in individuals, because they're sources of support, they're sources of feedback, they're sources of actual practical support as well as emotional support and feedback and ideas. They're also sources of a positive emotion, and through the positive interactions that we have with each other. When we have a positive interaction with another human being, our body responds as much as our mood. And so I think that positive relationships have protective effects. That's what my message would be. I think organizationally, where we put things in place that get in the way of those relationships. So one of the things that I've observed is that organizations that don't promote social capital, the building of positive social capital. So the more positive networks I have across the organization, I create higher levels of social capital for me and my team, and then therefore across the organization. And those are sources of positive feedback, positive support, and positive relationships. I think it's really hard to overplay the role that relationships in organizations play. And when they deteriorate and when there's no support for mediating or moderating the role that those relationships have, then that's when we really see the negative effects. While they have positive and protective effects, the negative effects of a relationship that and then there's no support to mend the relationship or to moderate the impact of it as well.
Yeah, and that's really interesting. And, we're both aware of the Gallup studies about having a best friend at work and that strong relationship of having those people at work. And I think it's really about extending that and ensuring that we're really embedding that expectation, I suppose, in a way, or the ability for people to create those relationships and then having an environment that physically enables that to happen. One of the other things that I want to sort of highlight in today's discussion is that one of the other hazards that's been highlighted here is around remote and isolated work. Now, given the fact that we're all talking about hybrid working and everyone wants to work remotely these days, how do we kind of manage that? I mean, we've got two folds of this. We've got people who want to go and work remotely, or are we talking about really extremes here in terms, some of the examples they've given here are actually night shift operators and petrol stations, convenience stores, FIFO workers. Are we talking more about, our blue collar workforce here or our white collar workforce?
I think it's across all areas. I mean, there are what we're talking about in those scenarios is really on a scale. So it's one thing to be the sole person that's running a service station at night with no support or help. And I think you're not only facing potential physical hazards, physical safety hazards, but there's a sense of isolation and loneliness, and that comes from being the only person that's around to solve a problem if something goes wrong. And so organisations who have focused very much on the physical safety side of things also then need to think about what happens for that person who's had something awful happen and had to solve the problem themselves, or not even necessarily awful, just difficult, and didn't have the support and feedback. Again, we know that the protective effects of having those positive, supportive relationships around us, one of the practical components of that is we've got someone else to share the burden of problem solving. We saw this through COVID particularly, where we were forced to work from home. Well, many of us were forced to work from home. Some of my team really suffered through the isolation of being forced to be in their house by themselves. I mean, young teams with young people who live alone or live in a share house and need to just rock up to work every day in their bedroom, because you have a real responsibility as a business owner to support people, not just from the physical requirements of how they're going to do their job, but also the emotional and psychological components of that. And I think this is where managers and leaders really need to start to step up their game when it comes to the social support they provide to the human beings that are in their team. Even as we move into hybrid work practices where people have a preference to work from home, they still need human interaction of some kind. And so one of the things that you and I have talked about a lot is encouraging managers to be a lot more intentional in the way that they communicate, a lot more intentional in the way that they connect. And yes, it's going to be clunky in the first instance. It's going to sound really artificial. But finding your authentic voice as a manager of hybrid teams, I think, is one of the most important things managers can do to alleviate the hazard that is the loneliness that comes from working from home, especially if you live by yourself and you don't have other people around you.
So if you were to give, leaders one tip in that space, what would be your top tip in terms of creating that authentic voice or to be able to develop that relationship?
My first thing would be focus on belonging. So what is it that you are doing now, and what things could you do to increase a sense of belonging? If you've got a hunch that not everyone experiences belonging the same way in your team, I would attend to that immediately. And then I would find a way to have contact with human beings that are in your team on a daily basis. Even if it's a Teams message, there are so many ways that we can stay in touch. I would also acknowledge that human beings are human beings. They're not just the tasks that you give them. So seeing someone as a whole person, it doesn't mean that you're not performing. It just means that you're acknowledging that psychological states of mind, mood, mental health, they all make a difference. And then I think also really making sure you understand the protective effects that the team that you lead has for individuals within the team. That to me is another really important part of that. And really you can only do that by getting to know people, making the time to get to know the people that are in your team really well, making the time to stay connected, making the time to understand how people are feeling and how they're going, and addressing those as they come up, not waiting until you've got your engagement survey scores back to say, well, that didn't go so well, or what can we do differently next time? It's a real-time thing. This is Leadership 101, real time. And I think also then there's this other things like seeking to understand, asking great questions, all of those sorts of micro skills that need to come in to be able to live and breathe that as well.
So lots to do there, but a lot of it comes down to just making an effort.
Absolutely making the time and making an effort. You know what? How many problems would we solve if that was if that was the
Just a
response?
simple response, hey? So look, the last one that I want to talk about is something that is absolutely in your wheelhouse and so well aligned with the work that I do, which is poor organizational change management. Now, that's your bread and butter. It is, something that comes up as part of the work that I do. Relocating people or, transitioning them or changing their work environment is effectively a significant change to people's environment and the way that they work and where they work and how they work. Managing that well has not been something that I would consider to be high on the agenda of many organizations in the past. I believe that is changing. And many of the organizations I work with, hence the reason you and I get to work together so much, is because it is becoming much more of a focus. But now that this has been called out as something that is considered to be one of these psychosocial hazards, what do you think that's going to do to start to change organizationals' focus on that? And what are some of the ways that people could start to manage that more effectively going forward?
So I absolutely agree with you that this is being now called out. And I think it's been known for a long time, but it's always been perceived as expensive to do change management well. Huge ironies there because, organizational change management protects the benefits of whatever your change is. I think the reality is that any change, even if we think it's positive, even if we think it's a small change, or it's, moving into a beautiful new building, it creates uncertainty. And any level of uncertainty in our work life means that we have to work harder to regulate our response, to keep everything in check as we go to work each day. Uncertainty just creates something else we've got to pay attention to because we're suddenly becoming hypervigilant for the cues that are going to give me some certainty. And I think one of the first things that we need to acknowledge is that organizational change management done well acknowledges that uncertainty and it supports people through it. The misconception we have sometimes is that if we just had a change manager, then nobody would feel uncertain anymore. It doesn't work that way because making change in business is hard. Making change in business is often iterative and you have to sort of do it in little steps. So you have to actually change your mind halfway through the change. But what it looks like when it's done well is being honest, being transparent, keeping people in the loop, giving people support where their own individual response is not helping them. And then it looks like having a human expert in your change process from the very design phase. So when you first start thinking about what that change is going to look like through to implementation. And it's all very well to bring your change manager in after you've decided what the change is and you're about to roll something out. And that's fine. We'll help you with that. However, it would have been nice if we could have influenced some of the design features of that change, some of the early conversations that you have, some of the cultural challenges that you're going to be up against. All of those sorts of things need to be thought about in that change design phase. And you know how we're in a project, typically a problem in execution is actually a problem upstream in the project. It's exactly the same with change. You get an issue or a change management issue in your implementation, it's typically something that happened in design. So I think we're looking at change as an end-to-end process, just the way we look at project management now as an end-to-end process, I think. And look, we're getting there. Slowly, but we're getting there.
Yeah, it's coming. And you're right there, I think, too, because it's the reason I look at doing strategy rather than just doing design, because if people come to me when they're ready for a design, they've already made their choice on the property, they've leased the space, they've already made a bunch of decisions that affect the outcome that I can no longer go back and change. So it's very much that similar kind of idea of getting in early and supporting through the entire life cycle. So look, in summary, understanding how these psychosocial hazards are to be managed and the way that we're looking at them, they really all come back to ensuring the health and well-being of our people, which, regardless of whether this is something that's being regulated or legislated or imposed on us as businesses, these are actually really good things for us to be doing regardless. So if anything, we've just been handed a toolkit now on how to do this better, things that we should be watching out for, things that we should be taking, more notice of and putting in better systems, processes, support mechanisms to elevate that experience within our organizations.
Absolutely. And I think you and I have been working in the space of these hazards for a very long time. I think there is, for us, particularly in organisational change management and some of the work design elements of this and the workplace design elements of this, these sometimes might not look new to us. What's new, though, is the profile that this code has given them as genuine hazards in the workplace and things to be considered.
Yeah. Oh, great. Well, look, thank you so much for sharing all of your insights with us today, Meg. And as I said earlier, I will put all the links that Meg and I have referenced in the show notes so that you can go in and have a look at the resources yourself. You can start to see some of these hazards that have been listed out, but also there's some tools in there to actually go through and do your own risk assessment. So thanks again, Meg. It's been really great kind of getting your perspective on that. And I think I agree with you too around the fact that to me, none of this does seem to look all that new. It kind of looks like things that have already been doing. But as you said, it's now there's a spotlight being shone on it. It needs to be addressed within all organisations. And so this is just an opportunity for us to kind of elevate that experience for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you.